Okay, gut. Wir haben uns kennengelernt. Ich würde sagen, für diesen ersten Talk, es geht um Weltanschauung. Wir werden uns mit dem erneuerten Denken befassen, was Paulus auch im Römerbrief darüber spricht. Und ich würde sagen, Nancy, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, you guys already know me now. We had this little interview. So, hello, it's great to be here, and I did in fact enjoy the mountains. So the title of the theme of the conference is how to craft a Christian worldview on issues of sexuality and gender and so on. But the first question is, what is a worldview? If you're going to have a worldview perspective, what is a worldview? What does that even mean? So, as I mentioned, I teach at Houston Christian University, and even there, I sometimes have faculty come up to me and say, well, what is a worldview? What is a Christian worldview? The problem is that even people who've gone through, they're highly educated, but they've gone through secular universities and did not really have an opportunity to develop a Christian worldview while they were in school. And in fact, the problem runs even deeper than that, though. Many Christians themselves actually hold a secular view of truth. I'm not saying they have secular ideas. I mean, even their view of truth is secular. So what do I mean? What is a secular view of truth? Well, in the past, most civilizations held that reality consists of both a natural order and a moral, spiritual order. But they believed that they were integrated into a single, unified cosmos. And therefore, our knowledge of that cosmos would also be a single, coherent, unified system of truth. But after the scientific revolution, many people began to say, no, there's only one reliable form of knowledge, and that's science. Empirically testable facts. But what does that imply then for moral and spiritual truths? Well, they cannot be stuffed into a test tube and studied under a microscope. So many people began to say, well, they're really not truths at all. That's merely your personal feelings, your personal preferences. So the concept of truth has been split into two domains. And so sometimes, whoops, it went too far. So sometimes, wait.
Which one do you want?
So this one.
Then just...
Isn't...
Just a moment. Which one do you want, the second?
Yes.
There we go. So now, yeah, it's working. Just tap. Don't go like.
Don't swipe. Okay. What is a secular view of truth? Truth has been split into two separate domains. And philosophers sometimes use the metaphor of two stories in a building. And that's what this diagram represents. So in the lower story, we have science. And that is thought to be objectively true and testable. These are public truths that everyone is expected to accept, no matter what their private beliefs might be. And so theology, morality, spiritual matters have been placed in the upper story, where they're treated as private, subjective, relativistic. That's where you hear people say, oh, well, that could be true for you, but not true for me. If you hear somebody say that, you know they're speaking from the upper story. And the reason there's a picture of Francis Schaeffer there, that's the photo up there, and I'll talk about him more later in my testimony, because I did become a Christian ultimately through going to L'Abri. And he was the first person who really explained to an evangelical audience through his books that truth had changed, that it had been split into these two parts. In secular academia, this is called the fact-value split. Do you see the parallels? By the way, you could go back and forth. Here's what Schaeffer used to talk about when he said there's two-story truth. And then this is how it's usually referred to in secular academia, the fact-value split. Now, he didn't actually use the word facts value. I had to figure that one out on my own. it was several years after I came home from L'Abri, actually, that I finally realized when Schaeffer said, hey, there's this two-story truth, that was exactly what secular scholars were talking about when they said facts versus values. And so when I realized that, that's what I wrote my book, Total Truth, to help explain to a Christian audience, oh, here's what Schaeffer actually meant when he said there's an upper and lower story. And many Christians had not made the connection yet. In fact, they still haven't, because it's taught in every class in every university. Let me give you a typical textbook. So this is a textbook that says facts are objective. That is, they can be measured and they're truth tested. Value judgments, on the other hand, are subjective, being matters of personal preference. They're based on personal likes and feelings rather than on facts and reasons. Now, this happens to be an economics textbook. You did not think you were going to get moral philosophy in an economics class, but it permeates every subject area. And that's why young people come out of university completely absorbing the fact-value split. Now, most of you have probably heard the term values and maybe used the term, and this is not what you meant. You didn't mean private, subjective, relativistic. Christians sometimes talk about defending Christian values, and what they mean are objective, moral, and theological truths. So the central strategy in the secular text playbook, you might say, they have a playbook on how they're going to marginalize and discredit Christians. One of the main strategies is actually to deny that there is such a thing as moral and theological truths. That's what it means to put them in the upper story, that they're not really truths. Here's how we run into it in ordinary conversation. Have you ever heard somebody say, don't impose your values on me? But we never hear people say, don't impose your facts on me. Because facts are presumed to be objective. They're universal. The reason it's so important to understand this distinction is that it is the intellectual gatekeeper that is used to disenfranchise Christians, to deprive them of social and political power. Here's how it works. If you try to present a Christian perspective in politics or education, public education, healthcare, the marketplace, what happens? You get pushback, right? You say, you can't bring a Christian perspective, right, into the public realm. Why not? Because it's been put into the upper story, where we're told, well, it's okay for you to believe that, but keep it in the private realm. Keep that in your realm of the family and church. You don't bring it out into the wider society, right? Haven't we all heard that? Stephen Carter is a Yale University professor, and he wrote a whole book on this subject. He complains that elite culture treats religion as something private and trivial, like building model airplanes, just another hobby, not something to be mentioned in serious discourse. Now, Stephen Carter is a Christian, so he's saying this is a bad thing, but here's Pearcey Myers, who's a biologist, and he thinks it's a good thing. He's an atheist, and he wants to see Christianity marginalized. And in a documentary film, he was quoted as saying, I look forward to the day when religion is treated as a pastime that people do for fun on the weekend, like knitting, something that doesn't really affect their life. At a conference on science and religion at Cambridge University, reporters came in to interview the speakers, and they talked to a philosopher from Cambridge who has a Jewish background. And he told the reporter, I stand in my synagogue and I pray to God, and I have an intense relationship with God, but I don't believe in God. And then the reporter said, wait, what? What does that mean? And here's how he explained it. He said, religion is like reading a novel. You can get pleasure and meaning out of the experience even though you know it's not actually true. That's the secular view of truth. And it's even filtered down to the comics. You probably can't read that from the back, but the first frame, the father is saying to his daughter, "Did you really tell your teacher that math is against our religion?" The little girl says, "No, I said it's against my religion." Already you see how subjective it is. My religion, not even the family's religion, my religion. In the next frame, the father scolds her, "Danae, you can't just arbitrarily make up a religion to suit your own needs." "Oh?" she asks, "so how did the other religions get started?" The next frame shows the father has no answer to that. And in the final frame, he's in a bar where his drinking buddy asks him, "You've converted to what?" Danaism. At least it's a religion that's honest about staying ignorant. So you see the cartoonist's contempt there in the last frame, but really the message is in the middle frames. He's saying religion is something arbitrarily made up to suit somebody's emotional need. That is the secular view of religion. It's even in the comics. You don't have to read academic books to find it. In fact, let me give you one more example from popular culture. Star Trek, The Next Generation. How many of you have watched Star Trek, The Next Generation? Okay, good. Tell me if you remember this scene. The plot centers on whether one character is the Klingon Messiah. He has returned from death in fulfillment of prophecy. Sound sort of familiar? The Enterprise's Klingon security officer has to decide whether or not the resurrected Messiah is real, is this a real Messiah? And somebody challenges him by asking, one of the characters says, "What empirical evidence is there for the truth of these claims?" And he says, "Well, it's not an empirical matter. It's a matter of faith. You have to take a leap of faith." So what is Star Trek teaching people here? You know, this is not just entertainment. It's teaching us something. It's teaching us that faith is contrary to evidence, right? That faith is blind, is irrational. If a Christian were asked about the truth of Jesus' claims to be the Messiah, what would they say? Well, hopefully, they would start talking about things like the historical evidence for the resurrection, like the reliability of eyewitness testimony in the New Testament, the reference to Jesus in sources outside the Bible, like the Roman historian Tacitus or the Jewish historian Josephus. You might talk about how early the New Testament documents are, so there was not enough time for legendary material to be added, and so on, right? Or even that it was women who brought who Jesus trusted with the message, which was very countercultural at the time. In fact, critics at the time, Roman critics at the time, like I think it was Porphyry, who actually said, "Why would he choose women? You know, we can't trust. Why would Jesus choose to appear to women? Why didn't he appear to men? And important men at that. Why didn't he appear to the leaders of the synagogue?" So that was an actual argument made in the first century, that if women brought the message, it must not be reliable. So Christians, in other words, would start talking about all of these evidence from history. Truth is not divided. Spiritual truths are rooted in historical events. We still hold to the unity of truth. So it turns out that before we can make the case that Christianity is true, we first have to make the case for truth itself. Schaeffer called this pre-evangelism. And I'm actually speaking from my own experience here because already in high school, I had become such an extreme relativist. I didn't think there was any moral truth or any real truth at all. I was so postmodern already in high school. I actually was one of those young people who went to L'Abri and had to be convinced that there was such a thing as objective truth before I could even consider whether Christianity was that truth. So let's look at some of the practical implications of the fact-value split. If morality and religion are locked up in the private sphere, right, the upper story, then by default, what's going to prevail in the public arena, in the lower story? Well, obviously, secular perspectives. And let's look at a few cases of how this works in practice. So in the US, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in 2015. But what I want to do is show you how some of the arguments were framed. And so I'm going to give you a few examples from before that. I want you to see how the fact-value split is deployed. So this is when the Iowa Supreme Court, so the state Supreme Court, imposed same-sex marriage just on that one state. This was 2009. And it claimed that the pro-homosexual side presented an abundance of evidence and research. By contrast, the concept of marriage as a man and a woman was unsupported by reliable scientific studies and was nothing but stereotype and prejudice. To see how the argument is framed, one side has the facts, the other has stereotypes, prejudice. If it's framed that way, who's going to win? The side with the facts. Right? The same strategy was used in California as well as the federal court. It overturned Proposition 8, which defined marriage as a man and a woman. And the judge claimed that the pro-homosexual side, by the way, it turned out he himself was a homosexual. I didn't know that when it was happening. But he claimed that the pro-homosexual side presented overwhelming evidence. By contrast, supporters of the proposition expressed merely private values, which he rejected as irrational. Do you see how the fact-value split is used to discredit a Christian perspective? We have facts and evidence on our side. You have private values. So what's the winning strategy? If you decide one side, if you define one side as science and facts, obviously that's the side that's going to win. You see, for secular people, the word values derives from the noun derives from the verb. It actually means what some group values. Their tastes, their preferences, what they approve or disapprove, what they like or dislike. And that's why in the same case that I just read, Proposition 8, he said supporters of the Proposition 8 acted out of nothing more than sheer dislike of same-sex couples or animus against them. Animus means hostility or hatred or a desire to harm. By the way, he was echoing a Supreme Court Justice Kennedy, who had in an earlier case also said, it was a case involving homosexuality, and he said, people who are against homosexuality are driven by pure animus. In other words, these liberal judges cannot even conceive of morality as objective truth, but only as hatred and prejudice. And of course, the lesson is that whatever is accepted as science and facts is going to trump values anytime. And it's no use to argue that, but these are my cherished values. These are my deeply felt values. These are my sincere values. These are my traditional values. Have you heard those adjectives? I hear them all the time. And when people use them, I say, you're shooting yourself. You are shooting yourself in the foot. Because that kind of emotive language only adds fuel to the fire. It just reinforces their understanding that values are private emotions. Now, are even Christians shaped by the fact-value split? By the way, when I teach this in the classroom, my students say, this is the matrix. In other words, this is the mold that shapes people's thinking, and they don't even know it. If you say something from a Christian perspective, they automatically, unreflectively throw it into the upper story. They do not even hear you making an objective truth claim. You may be trying to, that you think you're making an objective truth claim. They hear you saying, this is my personal preference. This is my personal, my personal values, to use their word. Let me give you some examples of Christians falling into the fact-value split. This is an article written by a young woman who had just graduated from a Christian high school. She's describing her first day in theology class. She says, "My theology teacher drew a heart on one side of the blackboard and a brain on the other side. And he told us that the two are as divided as the two sides of the blackboard. The heart is what we use for religion, and the brain is what we use for science." How are students going to learn to love God with all their minds when they're told their minds do not even apply to religion? These students end up with a Christian heart but a secular mind. And that's behind a lot of the, I was talking to your brother yesterday, Peter, and he was talking about progressive Christians. This is why so many Christians go progressive, because their minds are shaped by the secular world. They may have a wonderfully sincere heart, but their minds are shaped by the secular world. And by the way, we have a name for this in the Christian world as well. What do we call that split? Do you know what we're talking about? We call it the sacred secular split, right? This is words you've heard before. What it means is people tend to think of, even Christians tend to think of Christianity as something that applies to one part of life, right? To church, Bible studies, prayer meetings, make sure you're saved and you're going to get to heaven. But they often don't know how to work out a Christian worldview for the so-called secular realm, right? For their business life, or their vocational life, their education, politics, whatnot. But what happens when students see Christianity as a subjective heart experience, but not objectively true? Let me give you a few examples. A few years ago, the state of Delaware was in the news because it had instituted a new program for teaching science, and particularly for teaching evolution much more aggressively. And a reporter asked a 15-year-old high school student what impact the class had on her religious beliefs. Well, she said it didn't have any impact on her beliefs. Why not? Well, religion is what you believe because of faith. With science, you need evidence and need to back it up. So what's the assumption? That faith has nothing to do with reason or evidence. You know, she thinks of faith as a leap of faith to the upper story. Here's another example on the college level. So PBS put out an 8-part series that was just titled Evolution. I used to write a lot on science, so that's why my examples are from science. So there's an 8-part series just titled Evolution, and they had interviewed 2 science students at what they called a conservative Christian college. By the way, it was Wheaton, for those of you who know. It was Wheaton, but I knew that, but they didn't say that. And these 2 students were trying to explain why they felt that they could accept evolution, but listen to their reasoning. That's what I want you to catch. Science deals with the material world of genes and cells, religion with the spiritual world of value and meaning. Do you see how these students are willing to deny that Christianity has any cognitive content? Is it true that Christianity says nothing about the material world? How about the origin of the universe? How about the origin of life? How about events in history like the Exodus or the resurrection? These things all happened in the material world. Let me give you another example. This was an English professor at a conservative Christian college. It was Eastern, by the way, Eastern University. He was writing for the local newspaper. And so I found, and that's how I found it. It was just in the newspaper. And in this article, he said that he was stunned, English professor, so his students were writing journals. He was stunned when he read his students' journals. On one page, they would describe intense worship experiences. And on the next page, they would describe their sexual encounters. And he wrote, "Most of my students are rampantly promiscuous. There's a significant gap between what they profess to believe and how they live. So what does that tell us? All of these examples, they show us that a subjective upper story ethic does not have the power to transform young people's lives. And young people will end up, even Christian young people will end up living just like secularists. I'm going to give you one more example. A man that I do know personally underwent a dramatic conversion experience in midlife and eventually rose to leadership in a Christian ministry. But secular ways of doing business were so ingrained that he resorted to them without even thinking. So, for example, to raise money, he used some very well-known statistical tricks to shade the numbers, right, to make his ministry seem far more effective than it was. Right? Because people want to give their money to a program that's successful, right? You probably think of that too when you donate your money somewhere. But you may not know is that there are ways for the organization to spin the numbers to appear more successful, to attract more donor dollars. In this case, the cheat was so obvious that the Los Angeles Times even picked up the story and took this Christian ministry to task for fudging the numbers. Well, how common do you think that is? The Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary found that 250 of the 300 largest international Christian organizations regularly mislead the Christian public by publishing demonstrably incorrect or falsified progress statistics. So what these numbers tell us is that the sacred-secular split is deeply embedded in the minds of many people who consider themselves Christian. And I would suggest it is the main reason that Christianity has so little impact on the wider culture. Sometimes the sacred-secular split is what causes people to lose their faith altogether. When my book, Total Truth, came out, we were living in Washington, D.C. So we had friends who worked on Capitol Hill, and they decided to have a book launch on Capitol Hill in the Senate office building. And after my presentation, a congressional chief of staff named Bill stood up and announced to the whole room, I lost my faith at an evangelical college. So of course I had to ask him, what happened? How did that happen? And here's what he said: the professors taught straight from the textbooks. But the problem is that most textbooks are secular. And some of them are actually explicitly, overtly anti-Christian. And the professors did not offer a Christian perspective on the subject matter. And Bill told me, I even met with my professors outside of class, right? I was knocking on their doors during office hours, asking them, how do you relate your theological convictions to your academic discipline, to what you teach in the classroom? He said not one of them could give me an answer. And that's how he ended up walking away. He concluded Christianity must not have any answers. Now, years later, I have to give you the punchline, he did become a Christian. He discovered apologetics, like I did, and discovered Lewis and Schaeffer and Chesterton and Os Guinness. And he said, here's how he put it. He said, I read my way back to God. So when people talk about a Christian worldview, what do they mean? It's actually pretty simple. It's not particularly abstract or intellectual. They're just saying Christianity is not meant to be divided into a sacred secular realm, that Christian truth is still a holistic system. It's still an integrated whole. Now, the fact-value split affects even the way people respond to evangelism. If you're out talking to a non-Christian and you want to give them the gospel. How many of you know Josh McDowell? Josh McDowell. Good. Yeah, so he's been around a long time. When I became a Christian and I was in college, he came to our college campus once because he was doing evangelism on college campuses. So he's been out there a long time, and he has his finger on the pulse, of the culture. And listen to how he describes students' objections to Christianity have changed. Until roughly the past decade or so. He said, I'd make a statement about the deity of Christ, the resurrection, the existence of God, and this is how you were heckled or challenged. I don't believe it. Prove it. How can you say a man was raised from the dead? Give me some evidence. But he says today he doesn't get the same questions anymore. He says, I'll make a statement about the existence of God, the deity of Christ, and this is how I'm heckled. What right do you have to say that? You're intolerant. You're a bigot. Who do you think you are? What right do you have to judge anyone's moral life? He hasn't said anything about morality yet. Some of you may know Philip Johnson, who is kind of the leader of the intelligent design movement. He said the same thing happens. He gets up there and talks about biology. He talks about the origin of life. He talks about genes and cells. And the first questions are, what about homosexuality? What right do you have to talk about these issues? So this is the fact-value split at work. If you're talking from a Christian perspective, they don't hear you talking about anything objective, even if you're talking about the existence of God, the resurrection, the deity of Christ. None of that strikes them as making an objective truth claim. So 10 years ago, a decade ago, they still asked for evidence, right? They may disagree with you, but they still think truth is objective, right? So you could still talk about reasons, arguments, evidence. You could argue rationally about whether Christianity was true. Today, they're not even thinking rationally about Christianity. It's completely in the upper story. So how do we overcome the fact-value split or the sacred-secular divide? Well, here's a distinction that my students find helpful. There are what you might call two versions of Christian thinking, and you can call them the Genesis 1 version and the Genesis 3 version. Genesis 3 is where we read about what? The fall. Exactly. The human race fell into sin. And if you start there with your message, it leads to sort of the classic revivalist message, right? You're a sinner. You need to get saved. And that's true. But if you start there, it often does lead to a sharp sacred-secular split. Why? Because it implies that the world in its essential nature is fallen, sinful, broken, tainted, corrupted, that there's nothing of real value in this world. And so starting with Genesis 3 often tends toward what's called an ark mentality, right? That the world is headed for destruction, and our purpose is to save people out of the world and get them into the ark. And there tends to be little sense that the so-called secular professions can be a spiritual calling, that the biblical truth applies to the workplace, to management, marketing, education, whatever your field is. I've had so many students, by the way, I've had so many students say that this describes their church, that they were brought up with the sense that, according to God, you are worthless, you are nothing. And they're coming from churches that start with Genesis 3. And by the way, if it doesn't apply to your vocation, to your work, then it doesn't apply to what we do with most of our waking hours, right? Dorothy Sayers was a friend of C.S. Lewis's, and she once said, if Christianity does not speak to our work lives, then it is silent about most of what we do. How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life? No wonder people say Christianity is irrelevant. So let's move to the Genesis 1 version. What happens in Genesis 1? In creation. Exactly. And in the streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can unpack a lot of themes here. So God has, he's created the heavens and the earth, and then he creates the first human couple. And what is the first thing he says to them? He gives them their job description. He says, why did I create you? What's your purpose? Be fruitful and multiply, and subdue the earth. And we can unpack that language, because be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean the nuclear family. Anthropologists tell us that all the social institutions grow out of the family. It becomes an extended family, a tribe, a clan, a nation, and you have to have social institutions for particular purposes. You need a state, a school, a marketplace, a church. So it actually means build up all of the social institutions. Right? So develop the whole social world. It's a very rich calling. And the second phrase, subdue the earth, means harness the natural resources. Plant crops, harness the fiber into clothing, build bridges, build buildings, invent computers, compose music. A student of mine once thought that was going too far. He said, compose music, come on. So I said, well, I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources that God built into creation. So theologians call this verse the cultural mandate. Have most of you heard the term cultural mandate? Because I find about half of Christians, when I speak on these issues, about half of them have heard of it and the other half have never heard of it. So this verse is called the cultural mandate because what it says is God has mandated us, has called us to create cultures, to build civilizations, to make history. You can think of it this way, if this was God's original purpose for the human being, when we sin, we get off the track. In salvation, God puts us back on the track. But what was the track? What did God originally create us to do? To be creative like He is. To be inventive with the raw materials He's given us, to fulfill the cultural mandate. And this is before the fall, right? So this is not abrogated by the fall. This is what it means to be human. In fact, I was raised Lutheran, so I kind of like to say, during the Reformation, Luther brought back the concept of vocation because the Catholic Church, the medieval church, had used vocation only for religious vocations, right? Being a priest, a monk, or a nun. And so Luther said, no, all of us are God's hands, God's eyes, God's feet. In other words, in the New Testament, God might have fed 5,000 people supernaturally, but He works just as much when He feeds people through the work of farmers and retailers. If God wants to, He can heal people supernaturally, but He also heals people through doctors and healthcare workers. God can rout an enemy using a miracle as He did in the Old Testament, but He can also protect us from evil through the police and judges and the military. God raises children through parents, teachers, pastors, and soccer coaches. So Genesis 1 tells us we should see our work as obedience to the cultural mandate. It's a way to fulfill God's original job description. So let me ask you, which version, Genesis 1 or Genesis 3, which version do most churches teach? Usually people tell me Genesis 1. I just said it backwards. Most people tell me it's Genesis 3 that they get from their churches. These issues have impact all around the globe. And the reason is that Christianity is growing all around the globe, which is good news. At the beginning of the 20th century, for example, Africa was 9% Christian. You know what it is today? It's about 40 to 50% Christian. And in the sub-Sahara part of Africa, some countries are 70, 80% Christian. There was a bomb in, I think, Kenya a few years ago, and even the secular newspapers were commenting that this country is 80% Christian. But here's the dilemma. Many of the societies still suffer from poverty, hunger, war, and violence. So why isn't Christianity making more of a difference? The problem is that Western missionaries imported the same Genesis 3 version of Christianity with its sacred secular split all around the globe. Here's how one Canadian educator explains it. In Africa, Western missionaries generally brought the gospel in the way they learned it, as a purely soul-saving faith, with no real bearing on anything else. Religion was mostly a personal matter, nothing to do with things like politics, science, law, economics, and so on. And he sums it up by saying, African people were given the gospel, but not how to build a righteous nation, how to apply Christianity to everything. So what happens is that after worship on Sunday, people go home and live like pagans. A missionary from Ecuador once told me personally, she said, Christians will pray, and then they'll consult the local shaman or witch doctor. An African theologian from Ghana says this. He said that churches have taught that Christ came only to save souls and not whole lives. As a result, he says, large churches have been built. Thousands of people go to church each Sunday, but transformation of communities has not occurred. And then a South African theologian says, if we want a new Africa, we need a new type of Christianity. And I'll end with an example of that positive, that new type of Christianity. And this is from Guatemala. The Pocomchi are a Mayan people, M-A-Y-A, from Maya, in Guatemala, and they are subsistence farmers. They're among the poorest of the poor. And the traditional religions in the region are animist or spiritualist. You know what that means? That means spirits are in the rocks, spirits are in the trees, spirits are in the river, and these spirits are much more powerful than you are. And as a result, it creates a sort of mentality that is passive, fatalistic, and fear-based. Because these spirits have much more power than you do. You might be able to placate them a little bit by putting out an offering, right? So that they don't make so your cows will give milk or so your crops will grow. But people have a sense that if you're poor, you'll always stay poor, right? That there's not much you can do to improve your life. A generation ago, missionaries came and planted churches, and many of the Pocomchi accepted Christ. But they stayed poor. They were saved. They knew they were saved. They knew they were going to heaven. But they didn't think being a Christian meant anything different in this life. Basically, they thought, you just wait to die and go to heaven. We might say they were converted in their religion, but not in their worldview. They were still passive, fatalistic, and hopeless. Later, secular development organizations came in with lots of money, and they built things like schools and sanitation systems. But when the groups left, the Pocomchi didn't use any of these expensive projects that had been built. Why not? Because they had not changed their worldview, and therefore they did not change their practices. If your worldview tells you the poor will always be poor, why send your children to school to try to better their lives? Finally, a young Peruvian pastor came to the Pocomchi. His name is Arturo Cuba. Today he works for Food for the Hungry. But this was the early 1990s, and Arturo taught the Genesis 1 version of Christianity. He said, we're created in God's image to be creative, to exercise stewardship and dominion over this world, not just wait for the next world. In other words, he taught the cultural mandate. And here's an example of how that works. One reason the Pocomchi had so little to eat was that they didn't have very effective food storage for their crops. And as a result, it kept being eaten by rats. So the young pastor asked the farmers, who's smarter, you or the rats? And the farmers laughed a little bit sheepishly and said, well, I guess the rats are, because they're winning. So who really has dominion here then, you or the rats? And they had to admit that, in a real sense, the rats did. So the pastor taught them the biblical principle of stewardship, that God has created them to be active, not passive over against nature, to have dominion, to take initiative. They're called to be creative because they're made in the image of a creator God. So the farmers developed a better method of grain storage. The food supply began to increase. Their children had better nutrition. They started developing better farming techniques. They built stoves for food processing, and they did start sending their kids to school. But it all began to shift. It began with a shift from a Genesis 3 mindset to a Genesis 1 mindset. That Christianity is not just how to get saved and go to heaven. That Christianity gives principles for your family, your work, the marketplace, for justice, for every area of life. So this is God's job description for them and for us. And I'll end with a quote from a missionary. So this is Leslie Newbigin. Some of you may know Leslie Newbigin. He's sort of a well-known Christian writer. And he says, we tend to think that the people on the front lines of doing spiritual work are the pastors, the church leaders, the missionaries. He says, that's not true. He says it's lay Christians working in business, industry, politics, factory work, and so on. They are the church's frontline troops in her engagement with the world. So the Christian church needs to see itself as the training center. Its job is to prepare people to go out and be frontline troops in the spiritual battle in every area of life and work. Speaking from a perspective of total truth, that truth applies to every area of life. So thank you. Thank you very much.